Welcome to MiceTech Talk with the Technical Information Scientists of the Jackson Laboratory. My name is Paige, and my job as Technical Information Scientist is to serve the research community by answering all of your mouse-related research questions.
And my name is Grace. I'm a technical information scientist here at JAX. And MiceTech Talk is a way for us to connect with the research community and to answer some of your mouse-related questions here in a live format.
All right, so hopefully you're ready with your questions because it's time for MiceTech Talk. So today, let's talk stress, social distancing, and cage density.
Thanks, Paige. Cool. Yeah. So mice, like humans, are social animals, right? So many of us have experienced some stress and anxiety from, pandemic-related social restrictions, as we've all been experiencing. And so really creating an environment that nurtures a healthy level of socializing and physical activity goes a long way to support both the well-being as well as the welfare of both mice and humans, right? And so in today's episode, we'll spend some time discussing the impact of caging configuration as well as environmental enrichment on the breeding and well-being of research mice. And you can think about considerations, especially for some of those strains that may have challenging phenotypes associated with them.
Yeah, so as Grace said, we've definitely prepped a few different discussion topics today. For any of you guys watching live, please feel free to use the comment section to tell us where you're viewing from, as well as ask any kind of cage configuration related questions that you have, and we will certainly try to answer those today. Okay, so today's episode is really exciting. This is our 1-year JAX-iversary. And so we really kind of started this live MiceTech Talks a year ago in the hopes of connecting with researchers like you on all things mouse related. So in that first inaugural episode, we covered cryopreservation of your unique strains, which was a really relevant topic at the time, as many researchers were certainly navigating the constraints of the ongoing pandemic. So not only have we kind of had to navigate these challenges in our research lives, we've also had to start to navigate these in our everyday lives. And one of the things a lot of us have had to do during the COVID-19 pandemic is pay attention to social distancing and limiting our social circles. And while this has been really good for reducing the spread of the virus, it certainly and possibly has left us with increased feelings of isolation, depression, or anxiety. So again, like Grace said, just like us, mice are social animals. So it's really critical to think about your housing design as a factor in your experimental planning. So there are a number of reasons experimentally why you might want to singly house your mice. And this certainly may be more common in some research fields than others. I found a really great example on this from Manuz et al. That published in 2019, which looked at the effects of single cage housing on stress, cognitive, and seizure parameters in rodent models of epilepsy. So this study just briefly randomly assigned 8-week-old mice to either a social or a grouped house condition or an isolated singly house condition. And then within each of those, they were randomly assigned to either the induced epilepsy or a control condition. So all 4 of these groups underwent baseline testing for a number of different measures for anxiety and depression, none of which were found significant at baseline. One of these tests was the sucrose water consumption test, which is often used to assess anhedonia or the lack of interest in rewarding stimuli. So after baseline testing, the experimental models were induced, so they were given a certain injection to induce epilepsy or saline as a control. And then they remained either in a group housing with 3 other mice or in isolated housing conditions for 4 weeks, and then they were retested. So this is what they discovered. They discovered that both the epilepsy groups actually showed significant lack of interest in that sugar water compared to the control groups. But what's really interesting is the impact of housing condition on this. So they found that the isolated housing or singly housed exasperated or made this lack of interest even more severe. Simply put, both the epilepsy and the control groups for the isolated house condition actually shifted that interest in the sugar water compared to the social housing group. This is a really important thing to kind of consider, because if the researchers only assessed the control mice and left them in a group housing condition, but put their epilepsy in a single or isolated housing condition, as is often necessary, and then compared the two, they certainly may have seen a greater or an exasperated difference between those two conditions. Some of this which would have been attributable to the housing conditions if these researchers hadn't actually assessed that. So I think this is a really good kind of first study to highlight the importance of carefully considering housing conditions, grouped or isolated, certainly as an experimental parameter when you're designing your experiments. So there's always a lot of other research. Grace, I highlighted this isolated or single housing example. What other resources are there for the impacts of co-housing mice?
Sure. So I think that's a really interesting example, and I'm glad you brought it up, Paige. But it's clear that housing alone may have certain impacts on the well-being of the mouse, as well as outcomes for studies, as you just outlined. But what do we know about group housing? So I know that personally, to bring it to kind of our own experiences during the pandemic, it's been really crucial for me to maintain contact with friends and family. Though certainly paying attention to my own space needs has been particularly important. And as it turns out, there actually is a significant amount of information out there on the space requirements and co-housing research mice. So what I'd like to do now is offer just a brief introduction into some of the topics that really have been pretty extensively researched in this area. But before we talk about that in more detail, I'd like to just take a few minutes to talk about some broader context here. So all of us working with animals in research are likely very familiar with the 3Rs, which were created decades ago as really a key framework for humane animal research studies. So the 3Rs being refined as replacement, reduction, and refinement, right? So the topic of care and management, including the density at which mice are housed, really represent what I think is an area where we can think of refinement, right? We can refine the use of research animals with welfare as a top priority. And so to extend that discussion out a little bit further, ultimately consideration of the 3Rs promotes sound scientific methodology with the aim of executing robust studies that are reproducible, where thoughtful care and husbandry, including caging density, really do figure prominently, with animal welfare being a top priority when making care and husbandry decisions. So we talked about this at the start of our time together today, and that is the consideration that mice are fundamentally social creatures, right? So this aspect of their biology really needs to be considered when making husbandry and experimental decisions. So well thought out husbandry practices, including housing density, should also be clearly reported when you go to put together your scientific publication on the topic. And I know when I was actively publishing papers, I'm not sure that this was something that entered prominently into what I was thinking about when I put my method sections together.
Yeah, certainly when I was publishing, you would publish, temperature and humidity, and even maybe what kind of shavings you're using, and all of those kind of environmental things were kind of considered. But I certainly didn't consider, maybe even the density, or if they were single or group housed, as another kind of consideration for our experimental methods, as well as in thinking about our results. So we really do kind of need to think about these 3Rs, again, to help kind of execute those robust and reproducible studies. And, a critical part of this is obviously thinking about those housing densities.
Mm-hmm.
Grace, what kind of resources and reviews do you know or that you can point us to get us started with that?
Sure. Yeah, great. So the guide for the care and use of laboratory animals, commonly referred to as the guide, which you may know of in kind of the research vernacular, that the guide does make space recommendations for laboratory rodents. There is also a note in the guide that highlights that space allocations should be assessed, reviewed, and modified as necessary, considering different indices with special needs based upon strain characteristics. So really the impetus here is that the space decisions should be data-driven and also be strain and context specific. So there is a review by JAX researchers, Dr. Karen Svensson and Dr. Beverly Pagan, that you should have, I think, in the resources that we'll have in the video description or so. And that review really comprehensively summarizes and synthesizes findings of a wide body of studies that investigate the effects of differing housing densities on research mice. So I really encourage you to grab that pub linked in the video description and use that as a jumping off point. Because what you'll find is there is a whole wide body of literature on the topic, different experimental contexts, different readouts to take into consideration. So what you find as kind of a takeaway from that review is that in most cases, increased housing density allows for the maintenance and in some cases actually improvement of animal well-being. And what I think is really key here is that you'll see that there really is a large body of robust studies that exist on the impact of an increase in housing density on research mice. Other items, one other item that I think is really key to touch on here is, and we already kind of highlighted it just a few moments ago, is the complete and accurate reporting of how you're handling these mice, what your care and husbandry practices are, including density. And that really is going to be a broader benefit to experimental reproducibility in the broader scientific community.
Yeah, I don't think we can say that enough. As technical information scientists, we have to read a lot of methods sections, and oftentimes that's where we go to find, these critical pieces of information, and a lot of times it's just not there, which it happens, but we can always do better, I think. All right, so let's see if we have any questions. I do see one question. How can you balance the need for group housing versus separating mice? For example, fighting versus postoperative care to prevent infection. Yeah, so there's always going to be certain instances where you certainly need to separate your mice. Some strains are certainly far more aggressive than others and may need to be singly housed once they reach a certain age. And then, of course, with certain, surgical procedures, such as, maybe a brain operation or any operation, you certainly may need to singly house them to prevent that infection. I think, again, just thinking about that you're treating your experimental and your control mice all the same, as well as, recording all of that information because it could impact your overall findings and results. All right, so we have discussed the importance of obviously these caging configurations and how we could set up our mice. What are some other data-driven husbandry studies that we've done here at JAX, Grace?
Sure, yeah. So again, the guide does tell us that it's really crucial to make data-driven decisions regarding how we're housing strains, which includes taking strain-specific differences into account, things that can occur among a certain inbred strain. So knowing kind of the normative biology of the strain that you're working with is really a crucial aspect to making some of these decisions as well. So a quick example of this, C57 Black 6 background mice, Black 6J, Black 6N, other C57 Black 6 background strains are known to, have a strain-specific kind of predilection toward alopecia or hair loss. And so as a quick example, if we use alopecia as a readout, we see that in a study looking at different types of environmental enrichment, what was noted in this study was that shelter type enrichment. So you can think of things like tunnels or domes or shepherd shacks. It was more effective at reducing incidence of alopecia in C57 black 6J mice when compared to something that would be classified as an activity type enrichment. So you can think of something like that as kind of a gnawing substrate, or like a trapeze swing, or an activity type enrichment. So that is an example of another way that, looking at aspects of enrichment and environment can be really important and impactful, and also considering strain-specific considerations there.
Yeah, so that's really interesting. Just by simply kind of providing one additional thing, like these little shelters, we were able to really decrease that hair loss, which can sometimes, move to even more skin-related problems. I think, especially when thinking about enrichments for our mouse environments, I always kind of like to think about how we nest ourselves at home as well. And how we kind of enrich our own environments. I think that, especially during the pandemic, I myself have purchased a few things, home items, and done home improvement as well as gardening to really kind of, improve or enrich my own environment, and kind of with the hopes of decreasing stress and anxiety myself. And so I think that we can kind of think about these enrichments the same way for our mice, and think about them again with these kind of data-driven approaches where we can test if an enrichment is going to certainly change maybe a strain challenge such as alopecia for any of our mice. Great. Let's see if there's any more questions. Okay, so I do see another question. What do I do if I have a single male or female in a litter of pups that I wean? Grace, do you want to try to answer that, or you want me to?
Well, we can tag team it. I think probably Paige just might be something, and it kind of maybe also gets at what to do with breeding males or so. Like I see that question coming in there too, and how to house them.
Exactly.
What I think we're seeing in the questions in the chat is different scenarios come up, and you need to make a decision about what to do for your mice, keeping in mind that what you're trying to aim for is an environment that is going to be hopefully environmentally enriched, and hopefully taking into account that mice are in fact social creatures, right? So in scenarios of a litter of pups, I'd say it's going to depend somewhat on your goals as well, what you're using the animals for, what your downstream experimental needs are. You can take that into consideration, make justifications around that, all within the purview of what's acceptable by your IACUC as well as your facility. But in some cases, with many strains, you can combine pups that are of the same age from different litters to kind of group wean them to take that into consideration as you're housing them. In the case of breeding males that have been pulled from those breeding cages and you're keeping them, that is a challenging scenario where, we know that, group housing, novel males together, adult males, is going to probably be a scenario where you have issues of aggression to contend with. So in those cases, you'd be really needing to look strongly at things like environmental enrichment, and making sure that you have all justifications in place to singly house that particular individual, and working within what would be the guidelines for your facility and your veterinary team and the IACUC at the institution that you're working in. You have anything to add to that, Paige?
Yeah, I think it's really kind of like you're saying, there's not a one-size-fits-all solution for all of these different scenarios. And it's just definitely something to think about even ahead of time, if you possibly can, to have a plan in place from your IACUC and your clinical veterinarians in order to address these types of situations. All right, so that's really all the time that we have for questions today. We do have a number of linked resources in the video below. I'm not sure that we have the paper that Grace mentioned, but it is in the webinar that we have linked here.
I think there's a whole slide in the webinar dedicated to that review, so you'll be able to get it.
Exactly. Do you want to touch on the other links as well?
Sure. Yeah, we've got a few links for you. Please feel free to grab those, click around, see what meets your needs. Mouse colony management services that we have listed there, as well as additional housing and health resources, and then the webinar recording for a deeper dive into impacts of cage and configuration on mice and research studies. So please do feel free. Look around, reach out to us. We're always happy to help.
Absolutely. Yeah. If you have any other questions, feel free to email us. And please, please, please join us for our next MiceTech talk, which is Let's Talk How to Test If Your Drug Induces a Cytokine Release Storm. And this is going to be on May 25th with our special guest, Dr. Jim Keck. And so this is Dr. Page saying, stay healthy, stay safe, and stay excited about research.